Hi, in this video, we're going to talk a little bit about linguistic isolates, specifically what they are, what they mean for linguistics, and um, studying them, etc., etc., etc. So, really quickly, what are isolates? They're languages that have no demonstrable relationship to other languages. So I put demonstrable in caps here. What that means? It means they're isolates for now because we haven't demonstrate a relationship. A lot of them do have relationships to other languages. They don't just exist in a vacuum. Some of them exist, not maybe perhaps in a vacuum, but more or less in a vacuum. And we'll go over those in just a little bit. But what we really mean is that they don't have a demonstrable relationship to another language. In other words, we don't know another language that they have been proven to have a relationship with pretty exhaustively. Some examples are Sumerian, Elamite, Basque, etc. There are actually quite a lot of linguistic isolates. You can go ahead and get on Wikipedia, look up lists of linguistic isolates, and it's quite an impressive list of ones that linguists generally agree are isolates. However, the status of these isolates is contested. Sumerian is a great example. Although most people agree that Sumerian is an isolate, there will be people who disagree. Linguists, for example, there is a Sumerian Dene hypothesis, which is essentially that Sumerian is part of the same language family as Navajo, Sumerian Na-Dene hypothesis, or Athabascan Sumerian hypothesis. There are other ones. Some people say, oh, it's probably related to Hungarian. The key is it needs to have a demonstrable relationship. We can't just say, well, for historical reasons, maybe these people were close together, so their language shares some broad similarities. There need to be systematic sound correspondences. In other words, you need to be able to look and say, hey, look, the word for fire starts with an F in Sumerian. It doesn't, but it's just an example. And it starts with a P in Hungarian. And a lot of words that start with F in Sumerian start with P in Hungarian. And you go and prove and show those systematic sound correspondences and other linguistic features that are shared in a way that we can demonstrate the relationship. And then we'll say, well, maybe Hungarian comes from Sumerian or some other hypothesis. But the Sumerian, that's not the case. The majority of linguists who studied it agree Sumerian is an isolate, at least for now. There's also another reason why they might have contested status is that small families and isolates are ambiguous. Okay, so what is a small family and what is an isolate? So take any language, for example. Let's say for whatever reason we couldn't find a language related to German. Obviously we can, but just say German were an isolate. Well, German has a lot of dialects. So are those languages that are very closely related? And so is it a small family of languages, or is it one isolate? And don't go telling people German is an isolate. It's not. Don't take that. That's just an example. If German were an isolate, it's not obvious how we would differentiate between small families, very small language families, and isolates, because it's not always obvious how a language should be divided. What's a dialect and what's a language, when the differences are considered large enough for something to be a distinct language. And because of that, there are cases that we have very small and isolated language families that were previously considered to be isolates, but they're not considered to be isolates anymore because they're related to what were previously considered dialects of the language itself. So how can we be sure something is an isolate? The language must be well attested. That's a first starting point. So for Sumerian, for example, Sumerian is very well attested. We have tons and tons of documents in Sumerian. It's an ancient language. So it's well attested. If there were a language that were related to Sumerian, that came from Sumerian, say there's a language that appeared 1,000 years after Sumerian stopped being spoken, and it's very similar, we would be able to know. It has to be well attested. It must not be a set of related languages, as we talked about before, and uh, an isolate might have arisen without any ancestor. Not just that it's arisen without an ancestor that we know of, it might have arisen without any ancestor at all. This is the case, and in that case, we can be 100% sure it's an isolate, essentially. This is the case with a lot of sign languages. For example, a lot of sign languages are invented or arise more or less organically from very small communities of people who have no other means of communication. So they're not based off of spoken language, and they're not based off of another sign language. They just sort of invented as a means for people getting to know each other. Another thing, the language can't be too old. So there's a balance between attested, how well it's attested, and how old it is. Because if Sumerian is really well attested, as it is, we can compare it to things 1,000, 2,000 years after it. If a language is 5,000 years old and you want to find a modern language that's related to it, and the difference between those languages, even if both languages are very well attested, it might be not likely or not even possible to establish a relationship. So the distance between, if we want to be sure that the language is an isolate, the distance in time between its attested form and something we might compare it to should be small. And what to do with isolates? So isolates are very interesting. They're interesting for historical reasons, because we assume that at one point there were related languages, we just don't have them anymore. And they're interesting for other reasons. So you can try to find a relationship, try to figure out where the language came from, what older forms there were of the language, or what languages might be related to it in modern days. That's an interesting and worthwhile pursuit. You can study the borrowings from other languages. So a lot of times isolates are surrounded, speakers of isolate languages are surrounded by speakers of other languages. This is again the case with Sumerian. Lots of people spoke Akkadian around the time the Sumerian was spoken. So you can study those borrowings, and it's quite an interesting thing to study. You can also study the sociolinguistic situation. Why did this language perhaps not spread around and then have dialects form into separate languages and become the parent of a new language family? Or why did its sort of sister languages not survive? That's an interesting thing. So there are interesting things to study about isolates, but they're also a little bit challenging, okay? Because for historical reasons we can't look at related languages, obviously, because there aren't any known.